at an overview today of how Congress is set up. And then on Wednesday, for your class, we'll be looking at the committees of Congress and how that affects the day-to-day operations of Congress. So as we know from our discussion today, Congress was established in Article 1 of the Constitution, and we did some reflecting on how it was laid out in the initial Constitution through the Federalist Papers. As you can also see from looking at Article 1, and if you take a look back at your outlines of the Constitution from over the summer, which seems like eons ago, there are 535 members of Congress. Make sure when you are thinking of the word Congress that you recognize that Congress is both the House and the Senate. Many people get confused and think when we're talking about Congress that we are just talking about the House. There are 535 members in Congress because it is 435 members in the House of Representatives and 100 members in the Senate at present. In the House, members serve 2-year terms and they have a very low turnover rate. This is something called the incumbency advantage. If you are elected once to the House of Representatives, you are likely to get re-elected. That is what low turnover means. So they have a very high incumbency rate. Incumbency rate is typically around 85 to 90% of individuals that run for additional terms get reelected. Question? Two years, yeah. Yes. Yes, so that is quite contrary to what Madison claims or hopes will happen in that series of Federalist Papers that we read. Yes, yeah, he's very much so trying to sell Congress to the people. The Senate, they serve 6-year terms and have a more moderate level of turnover. It's a lot easier to get voted out of office as a senator than it is as a member of the House. It also affects the structure of these houses, affects how bills become laws. For example, the speaker bill referral in the House, where if the Speaker of the House, steps in on behalf of a bill, it's often very hard to challenge that bill's moving out of committee and into the legislative process. It's a way of fast-tracking legislation. Whereas in the Senate, because it's a different structure, they have a much easier time challenging referrals of the president pro tem. Also, in the House, they have what's known as a Rules Committee. The House is much more structured. Because think of it this way, you need to have much more structure and order with 435 people than you do with 100 people. And yes, Madison also discusses that in that series of Federalist Papers. And the Rules Committee can do things like controlling the time of the debate, also when the bills are going to be scheduled for votes, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the less formal Senate, as far as the structures are concerned, they're agreed to by the majority and minority leaders, so both sides have much more input versus whoever's controlling the Rules Committee in the House. Additional differences. In the House, debate is limited to 1 hour, and that's a very short period of time when you have 435 people. No, everybody. Yes, and it's very difficult. And then in the Senate, they have unlimited debate unless the rule of cloture is invoked. And cloture is a method of essentially busting a filibuster, but it requires 2/3 of the people in the Senate to vote for cloture to end the filibuster, and that rarely happens. In the House, members are policy specialists. Because there are so many people in the House, people serve on one committee. And so they are able to specialize on the issues in that particular committee that they're dealing with. Because there are less people in the Senate and only 2 less committees, those members have to serve on several committees. And so they're more policy generalists than policy specialists. The emphasis through Article 1 of the Constitution in the House is on tax and revenue policy. All revenue bills must originate in the House, whereas the Senate emphasizes foreign policy, because if you think about the fact that the Senate has to ratify treaties that are written by the president or his appointees, and they also have to approve presidential appointments for foreign policy positions. They also have to, be very well versed in foreign policy. So the House is more formal and impersonal amongst its members, whereas the Senate is more informal and personal. So who is the leadership in the House? The House is led by the Speaker, who is oftentimes the most senior member of the majority party. This does not mean that the person is the oldest individual, nor does it mean, necessarily that they, in today's day and age, are the longest serving, although they typically do have, a history of service in the House. It used to be the longest serving, but that has not always been the case. The parties themselves then have an additional leadership structure. So aside from the Speaker, the majority party has a majority leader who is the leader of, in this case, the Republican caucus in the House. They also have a majority whip. The whip is essentially the assistant of the leader. The term comes from kind of whipping the members into shape, getting them to vote in the right direction of the party. Majority whip and minority whip both serve as vote counters for their parties. So when policy is being considered, it's the whip who goes from representative to representative and says, how are you going to vote? And then the minority leader and minority whip are very similar roles, just for the minority party. And then we also have chairmen of various caucuses within the House of Representatives, and we'll talk more about those specific caucuses later on. In the Senate, the president of the Senate is the vice president. So Mike Pence just doesn't like sit around all day waiting for Donald Trump to die or get impeached or resign. He actually does get up every day and goes to the Capitol every day that the Congress is in session and presides over the Senate. However, he only votes in the event of a tie. The president pro tem of the Senate is, again, a high-ranking member of the majority party, and they fulfill the role of the president of the Senate in the event of the vice president's absence. And then again, we have majority and minority leaders, majority and minority whips. Now, within the House and Senate, we want to be very cognizant of party strength and party structure. The party that is strong has a strong ability to control party rules and organization, and also ensure that the voters vote together. A party that is weak, even if they are the majority party, has much more difficulty getting their voters within their representatives and senators within their parties to band together and vote together. And we're seeing that right now with the Republican Party. We're seeing a lot of weakness in the party structure, which is impacting how the Republicans are voting on Republican-supported and proposed legislation. For example, the recent so-called Trump Care, and then we're also now seeing this in debates over tax policy. The Senate of the two is less party-centered and more leadership-centered. So if you have a really good leader presiding over the Senate, you might have an individual who is able to get things done across party lines versus somebody who is struggling to keep, the Senate moving in the right direction. Party unity today is much lower than it was 100 years ago. However, ideology is an important variable in explaining party voting. So what the ideology of a party is at the time that we're discussing can have a big impact on how the party members actually vote. Because traditionally, members typically vote with their party 80% of the time or more. Again, particularly with the Republican Party right now, we're seeing a lot of disparity within that. Party polarization. This is what we mean when we're discussing how many times the majority of Democrats oppose the majority of Republicans. So in 1976, in the House, only 36% of the time in the House and 37% of the time in the Senate did the Democrats oppose the Republicans, or vice versa. So 70 plus or 60 plus percent of the time, I don't teach math for a reason, 60 plus percent of the time they cooperated. So there was a pretty good sense of bipartisan support for most legislation that was passed at that time in history. In 1995, this is as the Clinton investigations are heating up into like the Monica Lewinsky scandal. We're looking at rates of 73% and 69%, dropping in 2000 and dropping even further in 2001, initially in the post 9/11 times. We're looking at, you know, rates in the 40s, and immediately after 9/11, they were probably in the high 20s or low 30s. What do you think they are today? 100%. 76 was Gerald Ford. Yeah. All right. But what do you guys think? I mean, if you had to guess a percentage, what would you guess? I mean, 100%, 100%. Yeah, I would bet 70s to 80s. We don't have statistics, obviously, because this you know, session of Congress has not drawn to a close yet. But it did. But like, they haven't released numbers yet. But you can look up 2016 polarization. But I put 2017 since we're in the first year of Trump's term. I wondered what they might be now. I know, that's why there's question marks. It's to stimulate discussion amongst you. So hopefully the B block tomorrow will have some discussion on what they think it might be. But in 2016, the numbers were approximately 71% in the House and 67% in the Senate. So they were still rather high. And my conjecture is that they've risen since then. So the caucuses. The caucuses are groups that meet to pursue common legislative objectives. They may even be bipartisan groups. Our biggest caucuses are simply the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But caucuses can cause parties difficulties when it comes to policy formation, because, as I mentioned, caucuses might cross party lines, and they might sway members of a party to vote in favor of the other party's policy. We have some, you know, very specific caucuses mentioned here. There are even more than this, but it's a group of congressmen that get together and have lunch on Tuesdays. I don't specifically know who's in it these days, but they discuss, you know, issues that relate to to lunch now, to their regions. But more simply, like, you look at the Congressional Black Caucus. This is a group of African American congressmen and women, or individuals who are concerned about African American rights. And they, you know, get together to discuss how specific pieces of legislation affect Black Americans. Same thing with women's issues, the Rural Caucus. So again, these are going to be caucuses that cross party lines and may impact the creation of policies. So that brings us now to today's assignment, which is to examine the powers of Congress, which is something that we have looked at before. You're going to be looking at specific powers, whether they are implied, expressed, etc., and creating a chart of these powers, which are going to help us as we move into Wednesday's assignment, which is going to look at the committees and oversight functions of Congress.